What's happening, people? We're back with another piece on this final day of our Classical Days journey, and I couldn't rightly go through a special session of classical reactions without listening to something from Johann Sebastian Bach, one of the grand legends of modern classical music, and if not the pivotal figure of the Baroque era, certainly one of them, along with someone like Vivaldi. Prodigious in his compositions, prolific in his compositions, Bach is just an absolute monumental composer, and one who I consider to be as compelling now in the 21st century as he was in his own time, when he was very much extremely highly regarded. And his compositions are not only varied and dynamic, but they were recomposed for different instruments, meaning Bach would compose a concerto, for example, for one lead instrument, and years later he would rework it for something else. And so it is that this, his first harpsichord concerto, which is BWV, which is the catalog system for Bach's works, 1052, this one is thought, at least in some circles, to have been originally written for maybe a violin as the lead instrument. It was eventually turned into a harpsichord concerto, though in more modern times it has been performed, I would say more often than not, as a piano concerto. Now, there are some who dispute the fact that this wasn't originally a harpsichord concerto, and there's an interesting debate there. I don't know enough about it to offer my own definitive opinion, but it is certainly first recorded in terms of an actual manuscript as a harpsichord concerto, one of, I think, 5 or so that Bach would publish in his own time. This is the case with the first existing score of this, which is from, I think, 1734, though it's suspected that even if it was just for the harpsichord, it was written only a couple years before that, and it is an incredible concerto. Now, I'm only going to listen to the first movement now, though in the coming weeks and maybe months, I will listen to the subsequent 2 movements as well. But what I wanted to do today is to listen to it in the harpsichord form, and then listen to the same first movement in piano form. And I want to do that for 2 reasons. One, I think both renditions of this concerto are amazing, including specifically for this first movement, but also because I think it speaks to Bach's desire to continue to innovate his own work even after he would write a composition, and as well as his acceptance or understanding of the emerging instrument, the pianoforte, or just as the piano, like we call it today. So yes, Bach originally was skeptical of the pianoforte, and he was writing again for the keyboard, which either meant the organ, as a number of his pieces are written, or the harpsichord, and he didn't know if this pianoforte, now at the time pianos were not what they have become now, but they were still in a more simplistic form, but he, after an initial sense of skepticism, began to warm to the pianoforte before he passed away. So I think if he had lived longer, he absolutely would have written some piano-specific pieces and maybe re-rendered this concerto, whether or not it was something before a harpsichord concerto, as a piano concerto. So, long story short, I think it speaks to both the incredible compositional ability of one of the true masters of classical music, Johann Sebastian Bach, but also to his desire to keep innovating and to keep using the newest and most dynamic instruments that were being developed. So let's give it a listen, and unfortunately for this recording, I don't know who the harpsichordist is or who is conducting the chamber music arrangement, which is to say, as with many of Bach's multi-instrument pieces, this is not for full orchestra, but it's for a chamber music arrangement, and it is officially Bach's first harpsichord concerto for harpsichord, strings, and basso continuo, or just continuo, a term I explained when I reacted to the Vivaldi double concerto yesterday. So let's give it a listen, and this first movement is an Allegro, and as they talk about in Notame Cantabile, in which this piece is both discussed and performed in the narrative. It is defined by diminished seventh chords, which gives it a bit of an unsettling atmosphere, and I think it has great wicked drama to that effect. So let's give it a listen. This is with an unknown harpsichordist, and I'm hoping YouTube can help us here, because sometimes YouTube not only identifies the piece itself, but the particular performers and conductors. So hopefully that's the case, and if it is, I'll write it in the description. But this is Bach's first harpsichord concerto, written in the 1730s at some time. It's the first movement, and it's an Allegro. really need to listen to more Bach. And indeed, shout out to Yvonne, who recently, a few days ago, when I was beginning these classical days, journeys, sent me some compilations, best of, and including a best of Bach compilation, which has some movements from pieces that I don't have in my personal collection. So in the coming months, I will be going through some of those, and I'm looking forward to it. But he really just has an incredible sense of composition, the dynamic, ever-evolving melody here, the sense of tension, but also elegance, and of course, with the harpsichord, a very distinctly Baroque sound. And I know some people aren't perhaps overly fond of the harpsichord, being more familiar with the piano, but I really do love harpsichord music, and it transports me not only mentally and emotionally in terms of the quality of the composition, but with a sense of the history and the evolution of classical music. So yes, there's a very Baroque sound to this, in large part because of the harpsichord, but also, of course, the chamber music style arrangement, and it's just brilliant. I absolutely love it. As I said, in the coming months, I'll go through both of the following movements. There's an adagio, and then it finishes with another allegro, as well as the second two movements for a piano rendering that I'm about to react to after this. So yes, today I just wanted to do this side-by-side comparison and contrast with a harpsichord rendering, whether or not it was the original way that Bach composed this, with later piano renderings of the same piece, because I think it does, of course, lend itself very well to a piano performance as well. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to go watch the conclusion of Nota Me Cantabile, the second part of the final movement, while I process this video and get ready to shoot the piano version of the Allegro first movement. And I will see you when I'm ready for that in a couple minutes. Peace.